There is a type of pain that cannot be expressed with screams, tears, or explosions. It is the pain that is silenced, the one that transforms talkative people into silent observers. What makes someone who used to laugh loudly start speaking softly, avoid eye contact, and seem absent, even when they're right there? Many call this coldness. Others say it's emotional distance. But for psychology, what is happening is something much more complex. It is a profoundly human defense mechanism. When a person feels hurt, whether by rejection, betrayal, criticism, or devaluation, the brain enters a mode of emotional preservation. He says, "It's not safe to feel right now." And at that moment, disconnection becomes a form of survival. The brain and emotional pain. Neuroscience research shows that the brain reacts to emotional pain in a very similar way to physical pain. The same area, the anterior cingulate cortex, it is activated when someone is hit or when they experience rejection. The difference is that physical pain heals over time. Emotional pain, when ignored, transforms into a pattern, the pattern of avoidance. People who disconnect when they are hurt have learned, at some point in their lives, that showing pain is not safe. Perhaps they grew up in environments where vulnerability was seen as weakness, or perhaps they trusted someone who hurt them deeply. After experiences like that, the brain does what it does best: learn to protect yourself. He creates a strategy, and that strategy is disconnection. Disconnecting isn't coldness, it's self-preservation. Emotional disconnection is essentially an unconscious act of self-protection. It's not that the person doesn't feel it. She feels it, and she feels it deeply. But she can't express what she feels without feeling fear, shame, or pain. So, the body reacts in the only way it knows how, reducing emotional intensity. The heart races, the mind becomes confused, and the person withdraws. She avoids conversations, ignores messages, and pretends to be busy. Inside, there's a storm raging. Outside, there is only silence. It's important to understand that this type of behavior, it's not manipulation, although it sometimes seems that way. It's not that the person wants to punish the other with silence. She is in fact trying to regain control about an emotionally chaotic situation. Disconnecting is the most primitive way of saying, "I don't know how to deal with this right now. I need space to recover." The origin of the mechanism: childhood and attachment. Much of this behavior has its roots in attachment style developed in childhood. According to John Bowlby's attachment theory, we learn from an early age how to deal with rejection and emotional closeness. When caregivers are emotionally available, the child develops a secure attachment. But when love is inconsistent, sometimes present, sometimes cold, the child learns that it is dangerous to become emotionally dependent. This child grows up and, in adulthood, tends to disconnect when something hurts, not out of malice, but because she learned that love can be a minefield, and in order to survive, she learned to tread carefully, or simply to walk away before the pain comes. How the body reacts to emotional detachment. Disconnecting doesn't just happen in the mind. The body also participates in this process. The autonomic nervous system enters a freeze mode, a state described by polyvagal theory as defensive immobilization. It's the same reflex that occurs when an animal in danger pretends to be dead. The body lowers its heart rate, breathing slows down, and the mind partially disconnects from reality. It's not a rational choice, it's pure physiology. Therefore, when someone becomes emotionally detached, they may seem distant, cold, or even indifferent. But deep down, that person is fighting against one's own body, trying to balance an internal storm of adrenaline and fear. Disconnection and isolation. Over time, this protective mechanism can become a prison. The silence, which once served as a shield, transforms into a wall, and the wall prevents not only pain, but also love. People who disconnect when they are hurt often feel profound loneliness, but don't know how to get out of it. They are afraid to open up and be hurt again, so they prefer emptiness to vulnerability. And ironically, the more they protect themselves, the more lonely they become. Isolation transforms into identity. They begin to see themselves as someone difficult, someone who feels too much, someone that nobody understands. But in reality, they are just people trying to stay safe in a world that, one day, hurt them too much. How to recognize this pattern in yourself. If you notice that you shut down when you're hurt, there are some common signs. You feel an intense need to get away after an argument. Avoid eye contact when something hurts you. He prefers not to talk about it, even when he knows he needs to. You feel a physical emptiness in your chest, as if something has switched off inside you. And then she feels guilty for having distanced herself, but doesn't know how to reconnect. These behaviors do not signify weakness. They show that there is a story behind the silence, and every story of silence is, in some way, a story of unacknowledged pain. When someone disconnects emotionally, outwardly it seems like simple silence, but inside there's a whirlwind of invisible processes happening. It's as if the brain enters energy-saving mode, turning off the lights in an internal room that has become too hot. In this state, the person doesn't stop feeling. They just can't sustain the intensity of what they feel. Faced with an emotional threat, the brain activates the limbic system, especially the amygdala, which is responsible for detecting danger. But instead of fighting or fleeing, as it would in the face of a physical threat, it chooses the third option, freezing. It's as if it were saying, "Stay still, don't move. Maybe the pain will pass if you don't react." This behavior is more common than you might think. Many people don't realize they're doing it because emotional detachment disguises itself as rationality. They say, "I'm fine. It's nothing. I just need some time." But deep down, they're waging an internal battle to avoid falling apart. The brain interprets vulnerability as risk, and disconnection comes as emotional anesthesia. It's a kind of psychic numbness, a sophisticated mechanism created to prevent collapse. But by protecting themselves from pain, people also protect themselves from life. The human mind cannot selectively separate what it feels. When we close the door to sadness, we also close it to joy. When we avoid fear, we also avoid excitement. Emotional anesthesia is global. It doesn't distinguish between good and bad emotions. That's why those who disconnect after being hurt, over time, begin to feel increasingly distant from everything. Laughter doesn't come with the same force. Love doesn't vibrate with the same intensity, and life begins to seem like a movie watched from afar, with the sound low. But it's important to understand, this person isn't cold, they're frozen. And there's a profound difference between coldness and freezing. Coldness is a conscious choice, a posture of indifference. Freezing is involuntary, automatic, almost biological. It's a desperate attempt by the organism to remain whole when emotions become overwhelming. It's the same type of response the body has in situations of trauma. That's why many psychologists associate this behavior with past experiences of intense emotional pain. Rejection, neglect, humiliation, loss. Some learn early on that showing feelings can lead to punishment, so they internalize the idea that silence is safer. Others disconnect because they feel ashamed of needing the other person. We live in a culture that values emotional independence, that confuses vulnerability with weakness. We grow up hearing that we need to be strong, control our emotions, and not let anyone notice when we are hurt. And so, little by little, we learn to hide behind polite smiles and short sentences. The problem is that this prolonged disconnection creates a secondary wound. The person begins to feel invisible, not only to others, but to themselves. They become so accustomed to suppressing their feelings that they lose their own emotional access. When they try to reconnect, they seem unable to find the way. Emotions become numb, words seem distant, and the feeling is one of emptiness that is difficult to explain. This emptiness, paradoxically, is the price of having protected oneself too much. In relationships, emotional detachment is one of the biggest causes of estrangement. The person who disconnects believes they are avoiding conflict but ends up creating another. The conflict of absence. The partner senses that something has changed, that the gaze has lost warmth, that the conversations have become superficial, and without understanding what is happening, they interpret this as disinterest. A cycle of misunderstandings is then created. One withdraws to protect themselves. The other feels rejected and reacts with demands, which further reinforces the desire for distance. It's a silent dance where both end up wounded. In fact, the act of disconnecting is an attempt to maintain control. The person feels that if they remain emotionally involved, they will lose control over their own pain. They fear exploding, crying too much, saying what they didn't want to say. So they prefer to contain everything, withdraw, pretend that nothing is happening. But this containment is like holding your breath for too long. Eventually the air runs out. The mind can endure silence for a while, but the body stores every unexpressed emotion. Muscle tension, migraines, insomnia, gastrointestinal problems. All of this can be the body trying to say what the mind refuses to feel. Many psychologists observe that emotional disconnection is a form of adaptive trauma. That is, a learned behavior to cope with an emotionally unpredictable environment. It's a strategy that made sense at some point in life, but which in adulthood becomes an obstacle. The person who learned to protect themselves later finds themselves unable to surrender. They want to love, but are afraid. They want to trust, but doubt. They want to open up, but the voice won't come out. It's a conflict between the desire for closeness and the instinct for self-preservation. When we look closer, we realize that emotional disconnection is not a flaw, but a cry for help. Silence, in fact, is the body saying, "I can't stand feeling this alone anymore." But since no one listens, it becomes even quieter. This is the paradox of people who disconnect. The more they need connection, the more they distance themselves from it. And this distancing is not an act of lack of love. It's a reflection of fear. Fear of reliving old wounds, fear of trusting and being betrayed, fear of feeling and being overwhelmed again. The good news is that this pattern can be recognized and transformed. But the first step is not to force reconnection, but rather to embrace one's own disconnection, to understand that it arose as a form of protection, that silence was, for a long time, the way the body found to survive pain. When a person manages to look at this mechanism with compassion, instead of guilt, something begins to change. They begin to realize that they no longer need to defend themselves all the time, that now there is space to feel, to talk, to ask for help. This is where psychology becomes a powerful ally. Through therapy, the individual learns to recognize the triggers that lead them to disconnect. They learn to name what they feel, to give form to what was previously just confusion. Language has immense power over emotional healing. When we can say, "I felt hurt, I shut down because I was afraid, I disconnected because I didn't know how to cope," the brain understands that it no longer needs to resort to silence as a defense. Pain gains meaning, and what has meaning can be healed. Disconnecting is human. We all do it to some degree. But when silence becomes a habit, it ceases to protect and begins to imprison. True strength lies not in avoiding pain, but in learning to go through it without losing oneself. The challenge is to remain present even when instinct tells you to flee, to choose vulnerability as an act of courage, to understand that feeling is not weakness. It is what makes us alive. Rebuilding emotional connection after disconnecting is like relearning to breathe after being underwater for a long time. At first, the air feels heavy, the chest aches, there's a fear of drowning again. But, little by little, the body remembers that it's safe to breathe. That feeling doesn't kill, it only shows that we are still alive. Reconnecting with one's own emotions is a delicate process that requires patience and kindness towards oneself. The mind that has learned to protect itself needs to be convinced that it is no longer in danger. Healing begins with recognition. Admitting that we withdrew not out of weakness, but as a survival reflex. When we can look at our own silence without judging it, something within us begins to relax. It's as if we're saying to ourselves, "It's okay, you protected yourself. You did the best you knew how." This acceptance is fundamental, because as long as we blame ourselves for withdrawing, we remain trapped in the same cycle of pain and defense. Only when we embrace what happened do we open space for the new. Many believe that reconnecting means feeling everything all at once, but that's not the case. Emotional reconnection happens in small doses, in subtle, almost imperceptible gestures. Sometimes it begins with a simple, "How am I feeling right now?" and a moment of silent listening. Other times, with an honest conversation that has been avoided for a long time. The important thing is to understand that feeling is a gradual process. Emotions return like the sun after a storm. First a timid glimmer, then a gentle warmth, until suddenly the whole day is illuminated. In psychology, we talk a lot about emotional regulation, the ability to perceive what we feel and respond in a healthy way. People who disconnect when they are hurt often have difficulty with this regulation because they were taught to repress, not understand their emotions. Relearning to regulate is like relearning a forgotten language. At first it seems strange, but with practice comes fluency. The key is awareness, noticing when the body begins to shut down, when the heart races, when the urge to be silent arises. At that moment, the simple act of taking a deep breath and saying, "It's okay to feel this way," already begins to change the pattern. There is something profoundly liberating in realizing that we can remain present even in the face of pain, that we can look at someone who has hurt us, feel the wound throb, and still not run away. This is what we call emotional resilience, the ability to remain whole even when something breaks inside. It doesn't mean accepting abuse, nor pretending nothing happened. It means allowing the pain to exist without letting it control our actions. It's about transforming silence into presence. In relationships, this transformation is visible. When a person learns to reconnect, they begin to communicate their feelings more clearly. Instead of withdrawing, they say, "I need some time, but I want you to know I'm still here." This simple phrase changes everything. It conveys security to the other person and creates a space of mutual empathy. Silence ceases to be a wall and becomes a bridge. Vulnerability, once feared, becomes a language of closeness. But this process isn't always easy. Sometimes the first attempt to open up brings to the surface old pains, forgotten memories, resentments that still throbbed hidden. In these moments, it's common to have the impulse to retreat again, and that's okay. Emotional growth isn't linear. There are advances and setbacks. There are days of courage and days of withdrawal. The important thing is not to punish yourself for it. Each attempt to feel, even if imperfect, is a step towards healing. Therapy plays an essential role in this process. A good therapist doesn't force the patient to speak. They offer presence. They teach that silence doesn't need to be broken by force, but understood, that sometimes, before speaking, one simply needs to be listened to. In a safe environment, the person begins to explore new ways of being in the world. They learn that it's possible to express sadness without being ridiculed, to show fear without being rejected, to admit pain without being judged. And little by little, the body begins to understand that it no longer needs to shut down. Reconnection also involves the body. Emotions don't just live in the mind, but in every muscle, in every breath. Body awareness practices, such as deep breathing, meditation, yoga, or mindful walking, help restore the link between feeling and being present. When we breathe mindfully, we send the nervous system the message that it is safe to remain. The body, which previously associated emotions with threat, begins to associate them with life. But perhaps the most profound step in reconnection is forgiveness. Not the superficial forgiveness of someone trying to forget, but the forgiveness that springs from understanding. Forgiving oneself for having remained silent, for having run away, for having hidden. Understanding that in each moment of separation, there was a legitimate desire for peace. That the disconnection was not a character flaw, but a request for rest. When we look at our own past with tenderness, we free a part of ourselves that was still trapped there. There is a silent beauty in the act of feeling again. At first it's frightening. Tears come without warning. Anger appears where before there was only apathy. The heart seems more vulnerable. But this is how the soul says it is returning to inhabit the body. The emotional thawing is painful, but necessary. And when it happens, life gains colors that seemed forgotten. Small gestures regain meaning. A touch, a look, a smile. Everything that was once just routine becomes a living presence again. This is where we understand something essential. Connecting isn't about exposing oneself to suffering. It's about allowing oneself to live. Pain is part of it, but it's not everything. Fear exists, but it doesn't need to be in control. Vulnerability is the price of authenticity, and authenticity is what gives meaning to relationships. When we stop running away from ourselves, we begin to build more genuine bonds with others. Ultimately, healing from disconnection doesn't happen when we eliminate the pain, but when it stops scaring us, when we can look at our wounds and see in them not weakness, but wisdom. Every time we choose to stay, even trembling inside, we take a step towards emotional freedom, and that freedom is what finally allows us to love without fear. There comes a point when we understand that life isn't just about security, but about presence, that protecting ourselves too much is also a way of disappearing, and that feeling, however risky it may seem, is the only way to truly exist. People who disconnect when they're hurt, deep down, don't want to distance themselves from the world. They just want to be sure the world won't hurt them again. The problem is that this certainty doesn't exist. Life, by nature, is unpredictable, and it is in this space of uncertainty that both pain and beauty reside. When we accept this, something inside us loosens. We stop fighting the waves and learn to float. We understand that it's not necessary to control every emotion, only to accompany it until it passes. Emotions are like visitors. They come, stay for a while, and leave. None of them are permanent. Sadness comes to cleanse. Anger comes to protect. Fear comes to warn. Each one fulfills a vital function. When we stop resisting them, they become our allies. Emotionally mature people aren't those who never get hurt. They're those who know how to bounce back after being hurt. They feel deeply, but they don't get lost in the pain. They cry, reflect, breathe, and move on. They've learned that disconnecting can be necessary at times, but that true healing comes from reconnection. Knowing when to withdraw is important, but knowing when to return is essential, and that return always begins with a small act of courage, opening your heart, even if it still hurts. The human heart is incredibly resilient. It can break countless times and still continue beating with hope. Each disappointment teaches something about limits, about what we deserve, about the importance of choosing with whom we share our vulnerability. When someone who previously shut down begins to allow themselves to feel, they don't revert to being the same person. They become a more whole person. The pain that once caused them to close themselves off transforms into wisdom about how to remain open without losing themselves. Living connected doesn't mean being available all the time, nor ignoring the need for emotional rest. It means knowing how to balance presence and protection, openness and boundaries. It means having the courage to be fully present in life, even when it's not kind. Vulnerability is not an invitation to weakness, but to truth. And truth, when embraced, liberates. Many confuse the act of protecting oneself with shutting down. Protecting oneself means setting healthy boundaries, saying, "This hurts me," without needing to disappear. Shutting down means denying one's own feelings. Balance is born when we can say no without needing to disconnect from who we are. When we can express pain without turning to stone. When we can love and still maintain respect for ourselves. This is the point where emotional maturity flourishes. Empathy also plays a fundamental role in this process. When we understand what's going on inside someone who disconnects, we stop judging and begin to understand. Instead of saying "you're cold," we start saying, "I understand you were protecting yourself." This change in perspective can completely transform a relationship. Empathy builds bridges where there were once walls. It allows the other person to feel seen, and by feeling seen, they feel safe to return. And when we are the ones who disconnect, empathy needs to begin from within. We need to learn to embrace ourselves in the moments when we withdraw. Instead of blaming ourselves for running away, we can ask, "What was I trying to protect myself from?" This question opens doors. It shifts the focus from blame to understanding, and understanding is the first step to healing. There is a silent strength in those who choose to feel again after a long time hiding it. This strength is not noisy. It doesn't need to prove anything. It manifests itself in simple gestures, in a more attentive gaze, in a touch that becomes sincere again, in a word that comes out without fear of rejection. It is a strength that comes from acceptance, the acceptance that we are human, that we make mistakes, that we get hurt, but we are still here, trying to love in the best way we know how. And perhaps that's what it means to be truly connected, not running away from life when it hurts us, but remaining standing, even with a broken heart, continuing to believe that love is worth the risk, continuing to choose presence, even when it would be easier to remain silent, continuing to return, because return is the true miracle of the soul. Disconnection teaches us about the limits of the body and mind. It shows us that there are times when we need to distance ourselves in order to survive, but reconnection reminds us of the purpose of existence: to share, to feel, to be. Life only finds meaning in encounter with others, with the world, and with ourselves. In the end, silence is not the enemy. It is the interval between pain and healing. It is the space where the heart reorganizes itself to beat strongly again. The problem is not silence, but forgetting that, after silence, it is necessary to speak again, forgetting that love still exists, even after the wounds, forgetting that the heart, however tired it may be, always wants to feel again. And when we return, when we allow emotion to flow through us again, something lights up. The pain loses its weight, the fear loses its voice, and what remains is a different kind of stillness. Not the stillness of detachment, but the stillness of peace. This is the peace of someone who has finally understood that protecting oneself is necessary, but connecting is living. So, if you're one of those people who withdraws when hurt, know that there's beauty in your silence, but there's also life waiting on the other side. You don't need to force yourself to open up, nor blame yourself for closing yourself off. Just remember to come back. Always come back. Even if it's slowly, even if it's with fear, because it's in returning that the heart finds its way home again. And perhaps, in the end, that's what we're all trying to do. Go back home. Not a physical home, but the inner home. The place where we feel, love, cry, and start again. The place where we are whole, even when broken. The place where silence and words balance, where pain transforms into tenderness, and where disconnection gives way to presence. Psychology shows us that there is no healing without contact, no growth without vulnerability, and no love without risk. But it also shows us that the human soul is infinitely capable of starting over. And it is this silent and courageous restart that defines the true strength of those who, one day, needed to disconnect in order to survive, and then learned, delicately, to reconnect in order to live. If this video touched you deeply, if it made sense to you in any way, leave a comment sharing your experience. Talking is a way to reconnect, and perhaps your story will help someone who is still trying to find their way back. If you enjoy this type of reflection on human behavior, emotions, and the psychology behind what we feel, subscribe to the channel. Here, we speak honestly, with empathy and depth, without rushing, without masks, and with open hearts, because understanding the mind is, ultimately, the best way to heal the heart.